What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of the discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting crime topic, and it's back to the world of the American Mafia. We've all heard the name Frank DeCicco. What do we know about Frank DeCicco? Well, we know that he would be killed in one of the most iconic Mafia hits of all time. We would know that he was involved in the hit on Paul Castellano, but what was his life like? How truly respected was Frank DeCicco? In my estimation, and what I know about him, he is one of the most calculated individuals and was someone that should have been boss in the Gambino crime family. The story of Frank DeCicco next on Sit Down Shorts. Frank DeCicco was born November 5th, 1935 in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bath Beach. Now, Frank DeCicco's father, Vincent Boozy DeCicco, was actually a made man in the Gambino crime family. Now, he gets his nickname, sadly, from his addiction to alcohol. And he was someone that, from what I understand, was very respected in the neighborhood. And there were a lot of DeCiccos, and Vincent was the one, at least at the time, that was actually a made man in the family. Now, Vincent DeCicco is actually from the area of Potenza, just east of Napoli. So he was a Napolitan, and he and his wife, Christine, would ultimately have several children, one of which was Frank DeCicco. Now, DeCicco early on in his life would actually serve for a brief time in the military. Now, it's unclear of whether he actually went to battle or not. In the research and known history of that time, around the 18th birthday of DeCicco was really the end of the Korean War. So we don't actually know if DeCicco saw any actual combat, but he was in the military for a brief period of time in the early to mid 50s. Now, upon his release from the military, Frank DeCicco would head on back to Brooklyn. Now, one thing we would find out about DeCicco is, like other people in the Mafia, connected to the Mafia, he had a penchant for gambling, whether it was dice games, card games, any sort of illegal gaming. Frank was someone that enjoyed doing that. Now, it would be said that early on he would love it, and it would kind of, as he got stronger in the Mafia, veer off and he became more responsible. There's one thing about Frank DeCicco that I learned. He was an extremely intelligent individual, very calculated, and a lot of the higher-ups in the family knew that he was a rising star, a guy that could maybe one day be a very respected member of the family. Now, in the late 60s, Frank DeCicco would actually catch a federal charge and head to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. Interestingly enough, that's where he would get better acquainted with a young John Gotti. Now, it was said that DeCicco knew Gotti before this, but they would get to know each other behind the wall. Now, funny enough, in this picture, this is actually a pretty iconic photo. Notice Gotti has the Terminator-style shades on with the cigarette or cigar in his mouth. Now, in the back row, this is a who's who of Gambino crime family. Now, if we're looking at the photo, on the right shoulder of Gotti is actually Mickey Boy Paradiso. Right behind Gotti is actually Fat Georgie Remini, who would ultimately be a major emissary for Gotti. And then to the left, with his hand on his shoulder, is a young Frank DeCicco. So this actually here is a pretty damn iconic photo, if we're being honest. All of the four individuals in this photo would end up being high-profile members of the family, and one of which is still in Michael Paradiso. Now, upon his release from prison, Frank DeCicco in the early 70s would start to win over some high-profile people in the family, including Big Paul Castellano. Now, Castellano, as we know, loved people who could make money. And by this point, DeCicco had his hands in all sorts of rackets. Remember, this is the son of a gangster. DeCicco was very involved in, the extortion and loan sharking and stuff, but he was also very involved in the cement and concrete union, as well as the Teamsters local. Throughout his life, it was very talked about that Frank DeCicco held no-show jobs and was able to get no-show jobs in and around Teamsters Local 282, as well as other unions. And by 1975, 1976, as we know, Carlo Gambino would die of medical issues, old age. And in early 1976, the books would open. One of the first people to become a made man in the Gambino crime family in early 1976 was Frank DeCicco. This, to me, he was born into. We all know it. Some people's DNA just means the mafia. And Frank DeCicco, born in Brooklyn, the son of a gangster, his fate had been decided for him. This was what Frank DeCicco was going to do, and he was going to take a long road and get near the top. Now, being sponsored in the family, he would actually slot into the crew of legendary heavyweight in the Gambino family, James Jimmy Brown Failure. And Failure would also teach DeCicco a lot in terms of unions. They would also both live in Staten Island. Once he became inducted, as I said, DeCicco would be in the crew of Jimmy Brown. Now, sadly, as the 70s played themselves out and we really got into the teeth of the life of DeCicco, in 1979, Frank DeCicco would get some bad news. In March of 1979, his father, Vincent Boozy DeCicco, would die. That would be a who's who at the funeral. It was a long list of all five families attending. Vincent Boozy DeCicco was very and supremely respected in Brooklyn. And when he died, it was a sad event for the family and for Frank DeCicco. Now, Frank DeCicco not only was a great earner, he was becoming very respected, but he would also get his hands dirty, if you know what I mean. In the early 80s, as we know in the Gambinos, there was always a connection to the Sicilians as well. And during the early 80s, there was wars developing in Sicily. One of the people that was making his presence known in the 70s and into the early 80s was Sicilian John Gambino. Now, Gambino would get wind that the head of the Sicilians here in America, a person called Antonino Nino Inzerillo, was actually causing problems in Italy, and this would get the ire of Paul Castellano. The decision would be made that Nino Inzerillo was playing in different sides and needed to go, right? And I think this was also a ploy by John Gambino to obviously become the heavyweight as far as the Sicilians in America. Now, according to multiple people, including Sammy Gravano would indicate that John Gambino would lure his own brother-in-law, Nino Inzerillo, to a cafe. Now, I'm telling you this because it is very much well educated that Frank DeCicco that day in the early 80s was actually the shooter in the death of Nino Inzerillo. Now, I want to discuss a pretty interesting story where we got to understand the kind of belief that Frank DeCicco really had in the mafia. Now, this has been widely reported, and I know that on the Patreon channel of Mikey Scars, he would actually also collaborate and corroborate this story as well. He would say that when Mr. Inzerillo was shot, one of the other hitters in the case at the cafe after Inzerillo was killed would actually kick the head of Nino Inzerillo. And from what Scars would say and other people would say, this would send DeCicco into just a stupor, really. He was very annoyed with the fact that someone would kick the head. And he would essentially say that this was a respected member. And this is something you don't do. You don't disrespect people like this. It was against our life, our principles, our rules. Even though he was dead, it disturbed Frank, and Frank didn't want him disrespected after he was dead. It may sound a little weird to different people, but that's the way of life that we have that conducts business. And that was said by Gravano in this case. So he was actually annoyed with, hey, the guy's dead. You don't need to disrespect his body. This is what we do. We took him out, and that's enough. We don't need any more. So we would begin to understand the respect that Mr. DeCicco had for the life. Now, upon the death, this would actually elevate Frank DeCicco. By this point, he's a made member, and he's becoming very respected. By the early 80s, Frank DeCicco would become a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the personal life of DeCicco. He would be married and he had 2 kids. He would spend his nights at a beautiful home at 1300 Forest Hill Road in Staten Island in an area called Willowbrook. Now, in his work life, Frank would have a social club at 1628 Bath Avenue in Brooklyn. And during the end of 82, 83, it was talked about that Frank was spending also a lot of time at the Veteran Friends Social Club in Brooklyn as well. He would kind of move around between both social clubs. Now, I do want to get into a pretty interesting point where we really believed and understood that Frank DeCicco was respected and also very much a decision maker in the family. By 1982, 1983, it was becoming evident to boss Paul Castellano that Roy DeMeo was extremely expendable. As we know, DeMeo is one of the biggest assassins in the history of the Mafia. He is credited likely for killing over 100 people, him and his DeMeo crew. Now, DeMeo was starting to be a worry for the Mafia. A lot of people were concerned that he was a bit of a problem. Maybe he would become a cooperator. And a lot of things were going on with his cohort, including Chris Rosenberg, as we know. It was time for Roy DeMeo to go. Now, Castellano was looking for someone to take on the hit. Now, I do want to get into something. A lot of people, it's questionable on whether Castellano would actually try to get John Gotti and his crew to kill DeMeo. There are wiretaps that do confirm that Gotti essentially didn't want the contract. Now, as I've said, I like to quote, because I believe his show is very good, Mikey Scars. He would say that's not true. Now, whether or not I believe Michael, I believe most of what he says. I do think it's probable that John Gotti didn't take it. In fact, wiretaps would actually confirm that. We don't really know. In the end, it's not that big a deal. But ultimately, Frank DeCicco would play a big role in kind of deciding, hey, why don't we just hand this to DeMeo's people? If they can get close to him, they're the ones that are going to get close to him. The murder would be given to Anthony Center and Joey Testa, a.k.a. the Gemini twins. It is talked about that Nino Gaggi was also there as well. So another problem was off the hands in Roy DeMeo, and a lot of it can be credited to the emissary, the man who put people together, Frankie DeCicco. And this was all winning him over for a lot of people in the family. Now, as we know, by 1985, it was becoming evident that John Gotti had a problem. As we know with the Angie Ruggiero tapes and some of that sort of thing, the Gotti crew was in the hairs of Castellano. And Castellano probably didn't know it yet, but Gotti was planning something. Now, when I spoke to Sammy Gravano in an interview that could be seen here, he said that he was basically approached by Ruggiero, and it was said that they wanted to take out Paul. Now, in that interview as well, Sammy would say he was essentially the creator of this whole Sparks thing. But I think the main focal point of all this, again, was Frank DeCicco. Frank DeCicco and Sammy Gravano were hand in hand, and they essentially went along with Gotti in getting other people to get on board with the whole hit on Paul Castellano. Remember, though, Frank DeCicco was close with Paul. We have to wonder, though, by this point, did he realize that Castellano was just a bit of a hypocrite and probably had to go? My guess is yes. And he also probably knew that he was going to get a high-ranking position once it came time to kill Paul. Now, in that interview with Gravano, he would say that they came up with the idea to kill Paul at Sparks, and that DeCicco got wind that there was going to be a meeting there with Jimmy Brown and Danny Marino. And as we know, the hit was taken out. I don't need to go through the hit that night. We all know what happened in December of 1985. But I do want to get into a pretty interesting conversation between DeCicco and Sammy Gravano. At one point, it was said that DeCicco and Gravano had a conversation about John Gotti. Now, at one point, Gravano would tell DeCicco that he, not Gotti, should be the new boss after the Castellano hit. DeCicco would reply to Gravano, quote, "John's ego is too big. I could be his underboss, but he couldn't be mine. Look, he's got balls. He's got brains. He's got charisma. If we could control him to stop the gambling and all this flamboyant bullshit, he could be a good boss, Sammy. I'll tell you what, we'll give him a shot. Let him be the boss. If it don't work within a year, me and you, we'll kill him. I'll become the boss. You'll be my underboss, and we'll run this family right. Now, I have always wondered, I wonder if John knew about this. It's very clear. Frank DeCicco, by this point, is one of the most powerful people in the family after Paul goes. He knew Jimmy Brown. He knew Paul. He was very connected. We have to wonder if the situation that I'm about to talk about happened. We have to wonder, was John Gotti involved? And I'll tell you why. Obviously, DeCicco didn't become boss. He would become underboss. And he'd become underboss to John Gotti, who takes over as boss in early January of 1985 after the death of Castellano. Now, it wouldn't take long. In fact, only 4 or so months later, we would get to April 13th, 1986, a day that, as far as the Gambino family, would live in what we would call infamy. Now, that day, Frank DeCicco was at the Veteran and Friends Social Club in Brooklyn. As we know, he was spending a lot of time there and essentially running his business out of it. There were all sorts of people there that day, including Paulie Zacharia, Mikey Scars, other members of the family. Now, at this point, Mikey Scars is a pretty young guy. He would also say in this Patreon show, and I urge you to go check that out and become a member, he would say that day, when he was coming in to the club that day, he spotted a very odd car. And they essentially just chalked it up as it was probably just a Fed. But what would happen next is pretty incredible. We would know that that day DeCicco would leave the club and walk to his car. Now, alongside him walking out of the club was this individual, Frankie Hart Bellino. Now, he's a pretty interesting guy. Frank Bellino was a longtime member of the Lucchese crime family. He was actually made way back in the early 1950s with an individual called Fu Curiali. Now, Curiali was a high-ranking member of the old Lucchese crime family. He actually would also make Paul Vario at one point. But this individual, Bellino, was very involved with concrete and likely knew DeCicco through that and was probably there on Lucchese business that day. He would walk out with Frank DeCicco. Now, upon getting close to the car, Frank DeCicco essentially got in, and at that point, a bomb would explode that was placed inside the car. Now, the bomb was essentially C4 plastic explosives in a remote-controlled toy car. Now, the bomb was actually procured and detonated by a person called Herbert Pate. Now, Pate was a former military man who had some experience with explosives. He was actually a drug dealer and would ultimately become a Genovese and associate of the Lucchese family as well. Now, it was said that Pate would actually detonate the bomb, and Pate would actually get injured as well due to the heaviness of the bomb. It actually would hit his car as well. Now, as we would know, Frank DeCicco would essentially be blown into pieces and would die. And in that interview I had with Gravano, he actually would talk about the fact that he picked a very battered body of DeCicco up and try to help him, but he couldn't. It was too late. Ultimately, we would find out that through Lucchese heavyweight Anthony Caso, it was instructed by Chin Gigante to take out DeCicco due to the hit on Paul Castellano. Now, that is what we would, again, find out from Caso, who we have to add and understand was not very believable. Okay, remember, his cooperation agreement was ripped up. Now, I have another very plausible thought on what happened to Frank DeCicco. The question I have is, was John Gotti actually involved? Did he instruct someone to do this? It's not impossible. In fact, a lot of people were wondering that day. Mikey Scars would say that that day, John Gotti never showed up at any of the clubs after the fact. And a lot of people wondered, was he involved? We have to wonder and believe that he definitely viewed DeCicco as a up-and-comer and a guy that could maybe take his spot. Did he know about that quote that he made to Gravano? Was Gravano involved? A lot of people say he was, including Joe Butterass DeCicco. We've heard him discuss that. And we also have heard Sammy, when I spoke to him, kind of talk down that thought. But was John Gotti involved? That's a big question. It's one we'll never know. My thought is it's likely that Caso and Gigante were the ones that did it. But in the end, we'll never actually know. We don't know how believable Caso actually was. What do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. The truth was, though, Frank DeCicco is dead. And when we look back on his life, it is a fascinating one. It's one that we have to agree he probably would have become boss at some point. Maybe he should have become boss. I want to talk a little bit more about several of the other people involved in this hit. Frank Bellino actually would not die that day, even though he was involved with a bomb blast. He would actually lose his foot, but still long last his life. He lived actually until 2001. He would die June 27, 2001, at the age of 84 years old. Herbert Pate would spend not 1 minute in prison for this hit. He was never actually brought on indictment in this hit. He would, though, serve 10 years in prison for taxes and weapons possession. Herbert Pate would die in 2022 of COVID-19. Now, it was said that upon his release from prison, Herbert Pate actually left a criminal life and for about 20 years just kind of became a regular citizen. As I said, he died in 2022. Now, looking back on Frank DeCicco, we could say he was a heavyweight. He was a man who was calculated. He understood the mafia. He made a ton of money, could get his hands dirty, and was very respected. As I said, we have to wonder, did certain members of the Gambino crime family, including John Gotti, understand and know who he was? And maybe just got to DeCicco before he could get to him. We can negate and talk about John Gotti. We know he had some things that he was not good at as far as his abilities. He was flamboyant. We all know that. But I don't think we give John Gotti enough respect. He was a cunning cat, man. And if he was able to pull this DeCicco hit off, you got to give him some credit. This is the mafia in the end. And it's kill or be killed. And when you look at Gotti, if he actually had this, it never really connected back to him, and it worked. You'll never know, I guess. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss another sit-down video. I did want to thank the channel, RJ and Mikey. They did a very good video on Frankie DeCicco. I obviously never knew that Mikey Scars actually would marry into the Fabiano family, who the mother of Frank DeCicco was actually a Fabiano, which I didn't actually know, weirdly enough. So go check that out. I dropped the Patreon link in the description below, so check that out. We'll be back next week with another very interesting video. Yeah, I hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.